They have the numbers, we the heights. My epigraph is from Thucydides, and is spoken by the Spartan commander at Thermopylae. Culturally, we are at Thermopylae, the multiculturalists, the hordes of camp followers afflicted by the French diseases, the mock feminists, the commissars, the gender and power freaks, the hosts of new historicists and old materialists, all stand below us. They will surge up, and we may be overcome. Our universities are already travesties, and our journalists parody our professors of cultural studies. For just a little while longer, we hold the heights, the realm of the aesthetic. There are still authentic poems being written in the United States. Elizabeth Bishop, May Swenson, and James Merrill are all gone, but two great poets remain in John Ashbery and A.R. Ammons, and there are a score of contemporaries, almost of their eminence. The 1996 anthology is one of the provocations for this introduction, since it seems to me a monumental representation of the enemies of the aesthetic who are in the act of overwhelming us. It is of a badness not to be believed, because it follows the criteria now operative. What matters most are the race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, and the political purpose of the would-be poet. I ardently wish that I were being hyperbolical, but in fact I am exercising restraint. Very difficult for a lifelong aesthete of the age of 67. One cannot expect every attempt at poetry to rival Chaucer and Shakespeare, Milton and Wordsworth, Whitman and Dickinson, Wallace Stevens and Hart Crane. But those poets and their peers set the measure. Any who aspire to poetry must keep such exemplars always in mind. Sincerity, as the divine Oscar Wilde assured us, is not nearly enough to generate a poem. Bursting with sincerity, the 1996 volume is a stuffed owl of bad verse, and of much badness that is neither verse nor prose. How could this have happened? The last 30 years of intellectual decline provide the answer. Cultural guilt. Enthusiastic young men and women, and some of their middle-aged gurus, rushed forth in a great awakening of rock religion in the closing years of the 1960s. Their immediate provocation was the obscene American slaughter of the Vietnamese, but the Saturnalia that reigned for a few years, from Tokyo to Paris, quickly transcended the occasion. The epiphenomenon of the revival went by soon enough, but it was clear to discerning spirits in 1968 and 1970 that the consequences, though minimal for our capitalist society's ruling powers, would be endless for any cognitive and aesthetic activities throughout the Western world. Robber barons, in all countries, were immune from the contamination of the new enthusiasm. Nothing has changed, except perhaps for the worse in our political and economic life. The true legatees of the mock revolution were Ronald Reagan and his now parody, Bill Clinton. The change, all but catastrophic, instead afflicted our intellectual, cultural, educational, and aesthetic spheres in a kind of creation fall. Robert Hughes has termed what was born the culture of complaint, whose hucksters, academic, journalistic, pseudo-artistic, I've named the school of resentment, a rabblement of lemmings leaping off the cliffs into the waters of oblivion. Perhaps none of this matters, since good poems continue to be written, printed, and sometimes even read. Whether well or not, few seem to care. Yet it will matter to some people, as once it did, when we went to the poets to make our souls, as Yeats said. My mind was formed by Blake and Hart Crane, and then by Wallace Stevens and Shelley. The uses of great poetry are manifold, provided that an educated readership survives. Criticism, both academic and journalistic, a distinction that now scarcely exists, is dying, mostly because the universities have replaced literary criticism by cultural criticism, a would-be social science. To survive, criticism would have to move outside the academy, but it certainly can find no home in the media. If what Walter Pater called aesthetic criticism dies, then what he termed aesthetic poetry must in time die also, since we will cease to know good from bad poetry. By aesthetic, in regard both to poetry and to criticism, pater simply meant authentic or good, since he kept in mind always the Greek meaning of aesthesis, which means perceptiveness. If we lost all sense of the aesthetic, then we scarcely will see the difference between Emily Dickinson and Ella Wheeler Wilcox, or between John Ashbery and his weaker imitators. Scolding the universities or the media is useless. Enormous social pressures that do not affect the people in general or the Republican Congress, and not very democratic president, the people elected, have been loosed upon institutions hopelessly vulnerable to cultural guilt. Every variety of studies at last will be housed. If sexual orientation is to be placed with race, ethnic group, and gender as sources of aesthetic and cognitive values, then why should we not have sadomasochistic studies, in particular honor of the god of resentment, the late Michel Foucault? If there is a homosexual poetic, then why not a poetics of pain? If representation by category is to be the law of the universities, and of all those they influence, what minority is to be excluded? Shakespeare and Dante were European males. Is that worth remarking? William Wordsworth invented modern poetry. I do not know whether the more than 50 poets I anthologize all have read Wordsworth, but if they haven't, they have anyway, since all but a few write Wordsworthian poetry in the broad sense. Even where they have ostensible subjects, almost all of the poems in this volume manifest Hazlitt's characterization of Wordsworth's work. He says, Wordsworth takes a subject or a story merely as pegs or loops to hang thought and feeling on. The incidents are trifling. In proportion to his contempt for imposing appearances, the reflections are profound according to the gravity and aspiring pretensions of his mind. Hazlitt's personal ambivalence towards Wordsworth is palpable, but so is the critic's realization that Wordsworth has reinvented poetry. Yet, nearly all current published criticism of Wordsworth and almost any class taught on him at our universities and colleges now actively condemn this greatest of all modern poets on political grounds, because he betrayed his early allegiance to the French Revolution. By our means test, Wordsworth cannot pass. So absurd have the professors become that I can see no way to salvage literary study except to abolish tenure. Tenure is an archaic survival anyway, but it becomes pernicious when faculties are crowded by thousands of ideologues who resent Wordsworth, even as they resent Shakespeare. When I was a young teacher of poetry at Yale, the English Romantic poets were Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, and Keats, as well as Blake and Shelley, whose place in the canon I helped restore. On hundreds of campuses now, these poets have to share attention with the, quote, woman Romantic poets, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Landon, Charlotte Smith, and Mary Tighe, among some others. These were, to understate, justly neglected verse writers, though superior to many in the Best American Poetry 1996. Anthologies of 17th century English literature now give us, side by side with Donne, Ben Jonson, and Milton, a group including the Duchess of Newcastle, Lady Mary Chudleigh, Anne Killigrew, and the venerated Aphra Behn. I have seen my profession dying for over a quarter century now, and in another decade, it may be dead. If its function is to appreciate and teach Letitia Landon and Lady Mary Chudleigh, then the demise cannot come too soon. One asks again, how could this have happened, and not just in the universities, but in the publishing world and in the media? The New York Times essentially is now a countercultural newspaper. When Maya Angelou read a poem for Clinton's first inauguration, the Times printed the text, a monument of sincerity, and in an editorial praised this effusion for its Whitmanian amplitudes. Recently, one of the Times rock critics proclaimed our contemporary Mozart to be the glyph formerly known as Prince. Literary satire is impossible when the Times exceeds Nathaniel West and Terry Southern in outrageousness. If all aesthetic and cognitive standards are abandoned by professors and journalists alike, then the tradition of American poetry can survive only by a profound inward turning. Walt Whitman was not only the strongest of our poets, together with the highly antithetical Emily Dickinson, but Whitman is also now the most betrayed of all of our poets, with so much of the ongoing ideological balderdash being preached in his name. Whitman's poetry generally does the opposite of what he proclaims its work to be. His poetry is reclusive, evasive, hermetic, nuanced, and more onanistic even than homoerotic, which critics cannot accept, particularly these days when attempts are made to assimilate the self-reliant Whitman into what calls itself the homosexual poetic. If we are to have gay and lesbian studies, who will speak for Onan, whose bards include Whitman and the Goethe of Faust Part II? The most figurative of all our poets, Whitman will elude every effort to entrap him in an ideology. As elitist a Democrat as his master Emerson, Whitman continues with his ideas of representation to outwit his historicizing and eroticizing critics. The crucial figure in Whitman is neither himself, Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, an American, nor his soul, but the real me, the me myself, a conceptual image that prophesies Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot, and particularly John Ashbery. Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am, stands amused, complacent, compassionating, idle, unitary, looks down, is erect, bends an arm on an impalpable certain rest, looks with its side-curved head curious of what will come next, both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. That Whitmanian what I am, his real me or me myself, is both an inspiration to strong American poetry after him and a reproach to the cultural and erotic dogmas now circulated in his great name. It is no accident that the best American poets who have emerged from Whitman, sometimes insisting that they owed him nothing, are formalists, major artists of verse. Stevens, T.S. Eliot, Hart Crane, and even Ashbery, when at his most gravely traditional. Cast out the aesthetic, and you cast away Whitman, who was a major poet and a poor prophet, and who was, above all else, a very difficult poet, whose synecdoches do not unravel without very frequent rereadings. Authentic American poetry is necessarily difficult. It is our elitist art, though that elite has nothing to do with social class, gender, erotic preference, ethnic strain, race, or sect. We live in the mind, Stevens says, and our poetry also is either Emersonian or anti-Emersonian, but either way is informed by Emerson's dialectics of power. And Emerson wrote, "Life will be imagined, but cannot be divided nor doubled. Any invasion of its unity would be chaos. The soul is not twin-born, but the only begotten, and, though revealing itself as child in time, child in appearance, is of a fatal and universal power, admitting no co-life. Every day, every act betrays the ill-concealed deity. We believe in ourselves, as we do not believe in others. We permit all things to ourselves, and that which we call sin in others is experiment for us. It is an instance of our faith in ourselves that men never speak of a crime as lightly as they think, or every man thinks a latitude safe for himself, which is nowise to be indulged to another. The act looks very differently on the inside and on the outside, in its quality and in its consequences. Murder in the murderer is no such ruinous thought as poets and romancers will have it. It does not unsettle him or fright him from his ordinary notice of trifles. It is an act quite easy to be contemplated, but in its sequel it turns out to be a horrible jangle and confounding all relations. Especially the crimes that spring from love seem right and fair from the actor's point of view, but when acted are found destructive of society. No man at last believes that he can be lost, nor that the crime in him is as black as in the felon, because the intellect qualifies in our own case the moral judgments. For there is no crime to the intellect that is hypernomian or antinomian, and judges law as well as fact. That does not allow any room for the false generosity of any affirmative action in the judging of poetry. Printing, praising, and teaching bad poems for the sake of even the best causes is simply destructive for those causes. We believe in ourselves as we do not believe in others is a truth that makes us wince, but no one ever can write a good poem without it. Tony Kushner, who could be a great playwright but for his obsession with the ideologies of political correctness, ought to ponder Emerson's experience, from which I have just quoted. Every attempt to socialize writing and reading fails. Poetry is a solitary art, more now than ever, and its proper audience is the deeply educated, solitary reader, or that reader sitting within herself in a theater. It was inevitable that the school of resentment would do its most destructive damage to the reading, staging, and interpretation of Shakespeare, whose eminence is the ultimate demonstration of the autonomy of the aesthetic. Cultural poeticians, ostensible feminists, sub-Marxists, and assorted would-be Parisians have given us French Shakespeare, who, apparently, never wrote a line but instead sat in a tavern while all the, quote, social energies of modern Europe pulsated into his quill and created Hamlet, Falstaff, Iago, and Cleopatra, with little aid from that mere funnel, the man from Stratford. It has not been explained, at least to me, why the social energies favored Shakespeare over, say, Thomas Middleton or John Marston or George Chapman or whoever, but this remarkable notion totally dominates today's academic study of Shakespeare. First, Paris told us that language did the thinking and writing for us, but then Foucault emerged, and Shakespeare went from being language's serf to society's minion. No longer can we speak of the best writer, Auden's top bard, and if Shakespeare recedes, why call a volume the best American poetry? Certainly the 1996 volume should have been retitled The Most Socially Energetic American Poetry, and if I were not Bloom Brontosaurus, an amiable dinosaur, we could have called this book The Most Socially Energetic of the Socially Energetic. The madness that contaminates our once high culture cannot be cured unless and until we surrender our more than Kafkan sense that social guilt is not to be doubted. Nothing can be more malignant than a disease of the spirit that sincerely regards itself as virtue. Shakespeare, precisely because he is the only authentic multicultural writer, demonstrated that our modish multiculturalism is a lie, a mask for mediocrity, and for the thought control academic police, the Gestapo of our campuses. Each time I make the mistake of glancing at the Yale Weekly Bulletin, I shudder to see that the dean of Yale College has appointed yet another sub-dean to minister to the supposed cultural interests of another identity club, ethnic, racial, linguistic, with gender and erotic subsets. Shakespeare, performed and read in every country, with the sporadic exception of France, most xenophobic of cultures, is judged by audiences of every race and language to have put them upon the stage. Shakespeare's power has nothing to do with Eurocentrism, maleness, Christianity, Elizabethan Jacobean social energies. No one else so combined cognitive strength, originality, dramatic guile, and linguistic floribundance as virtually to reinvent the human, and Shakespeare is therefore the best battlefield upon which to fight the rabblement of resenters. Our multiculturalists are reductionists. The 1996 volume actually is asserting, our bad poets are just as good as your bad poets. Shakespeare, pragmatically the true multiculturalist, is the least reductive of all writers. His men and women never invite us to believe that when we know the worst about them, then we know exactly who they are. Emerson, in Representative Men, caught this the best. He said, Shakespeare is as much out of the category of eminent authors as he is out of the crowd. Shakespeare is inconceivably wise, the others conceivably. A good reader can, in a sort, nestle into Plato's brain, and think from thence, but not into Shakespeare's. We are still out of doors. For executive faculty, for creation, Shakespeare is unique. No man can imagine it better. He was the farthest reach of subtlety, compatible with an individual self, the subtlest of authors, and only just within the possibility of authorship. With this wisdom of life is the equal endowment of imaginative and of lyric power. He clothed the creatures of his legend with form and sentiments, as if they were people who had lived under his roof, and few real men have left such distinct characters as these fictions. And they spoke in language as sweet as it was fit. Yet his talents never seduced him into ostentation, nor did he harp on one string. An omnipresent humanity coordinates all his faculties. Give a man of talents a story to tell, and his partiality will presently appear. He has certain observations, opinions, topics, which have some accidental prominence, and which he disposes all to exhibit. He crams this part, and starves that other part, consulting not the fitness of the thing, but his fitness and strength. But Shakespeare has no peculiarity, no importunate topic, but all is duly given. No veins, no curiosities, no cow-painter, no bird-fancier, no mannerist is he. He has no discoverable egotism. The great he tells greatly, the small subordinately. He is wise without emphasis or assertion. Shakespeare is strong as nature is strong, who lifts the land into mountain slopes without effort, and by the same rule as she floats a bubble in the air, and likes as well to do the one as the other. This makes that equality of power in farce, tragedy, narrative, and love songs a merit so incessant that each reader is incredulous of the perception of other readers. If this be bardolatry, then let us have more of it, for it may be the only medicine that can cure us of the French blight that afflicts American culture and our academies. It is no accident that poetry is the principal victim of the decline and fall of our literature faculties. Almost no one these days is taught how to read a poem. There are very few who know how to instruct in that difficult art of interpretation, and the going ideologies distrust poetry anyway. How do you politicize this? All day within the dreary house, the doors upon the hinges creaked. The blue fly sung in the pane, the mouse behind the mouldering wainscot shrieked, or from the crevice peered about. Old faces glimmered through the doors, old footsteps trod the upper floors, old voices called her from without. She only said, "My life is dreary, he cometh not," she said. She wept, "I am aweary, aweary, I would that I were dead." The sparrows chirrup on the roof, the slow clock ticking and the sound which to the wooing wind aloof the poplar made, did all confound her sense. But most she loathed the hour when the thick-moted sunbeam lay athwart the chambers and the day was sloping toward his western bower. Then she said, "I am very dreary, he will not come," she said. She wept, "I am aweary, aweary, O God, that I were dead." It is ironical that in this bad time, American poetry is of a higher quality than our criticism or teaching of poetry. While it is true that several of the greatest American poets, Whitman, Dickinson, Stevens, Hart Crane, had either no or little authentic critical response during their lifetimes, they at least did not have to endure a cultural situation fundamentally hostile to aesthetic and cognitive standards of judgment. I marvel at the courage and desperate faith of our best younger poets, who have to withstand the indifference or hostility not just of society in general, but also of the supposed defenders of poetry, who now will advocate it only as an instrument of social change. If you urge political responsibilities upon a poet, then you are asking him to prefer to poetry what can destroy her poem. Emily Dickinson had the inner freedom to rethink everything for herself, and so achieved a cognitive originality as absolute as William Blake's. She had economic and social advantages that Walt Whitman did not enjoy, yet like Whitman, she did not have to confront ideological persuasions, either irrelevant or inimical, to aesthetic ambitions. Wallace Stevens could take for granted the autonomy of the aesthetic. How would harmonium otherwise have been possible? Or Hart Crane's first volume, White Buildings. I write this introduction out of the conviction that a literary critic has no political responsibilities as a critic. My obligation is only to help, if that I can, make it possible for another Elizabeth Bishop, or May Swenson, or James Merrill to develop without being impeded by ideological demands. I am more than aware that the resenters speak constantly of the ideology of the aesthetic and of the romantic ideology, but that is simply playing with loaded dice. The only pragmatic aesthetic I know is that some poems intrinsically are better than others, while romanticism, as I apprehend it, is a discipline in sensibility and in perception. In his essay, Politics, Emerson provides a spark for these times. He says, "It makes no difference how many tons weight of atmosphere presses on our heads, so long as the same pressure resists it within the lungs. Augment the mass 1,000-fold, it cannot begin to crush us as long as reaction is equal to action." The resenters prate of power, as they do of race and gender. These are careerist stratagems and have nothing to do with the insulted and injured, whose lives will not be improved by our reading the bad verses of those who assert that they are the oppressed. Our schools, as much as our universities, are given away to these absurdities. Replacing Julius Caesar by the color purple is hardly a royal road to enlightenment. A country where television, movies, computers, and Stephen King have replaced reading is already in acute danger of cultural collapse. That danger is dreadfully augmented by our yielding education to the ideologues whose deepest resentment is of poetry itself. What John Hollander remarks of Whitman, quote, "The poetry, like its title, looks easy and proves hard." Well, this is true of almost all poets or very good poets. But there, I hope, will be one of the crucial uses for us of the best American poems. More than ever before, our situation needs aesthetic and cognitive difficulty. The mock poetry of resentment looks easy and proves easy. Unlike Whitman, it lacks mind. When I think of the American poets of this century whom I myself love best, I begin always with Wallace Stevens and with Hart Crane. Stevens subtly gives us what he calls the hum of thoughts evaded in the mind, and Crane urges us to the most difficult transcendence ever visualized by any American poet. Their heirs, including Elizabeth Bishop, Merrill, Ashbery, and Ammons, have carried forward this mingled legacy of thoughts available to us only in poems, and yearnings made palpable only in complex imaginings. Mastery of metaphor and power of thinking are the true merits of the best American poetry of our time. I give the last words here to the sacred Emerson, from his Whitman-inspiring essay, The Poet, where the freedom of poetry is ascribed to tropes and thought. Emerson says, "The poets are thus liberating gods. The ancient British bards had, for the title of their order, quote, those who are free throughout the world. They are free, and they make us free. An imaginative book renders us much more service at first, by stimulating us through its tropes than afterward, when we arrive at the precise sense of the author. I think nothing is of any value in books except the transcendental and extraordinary. If a man is inflamed and carried away by his thought, to that degree that he forgets the authors and the public, and heeds only this one dream, which holds him like an insanity, let me read his paper, and you may have all the arguments and histories and criticism. All the value which attaches to Pythagoras, Paracelsus, Cornelius Agrippa, Cardan, Kepler, Swedenborg, Schelling, Oken, or any other who introduces questionable facts into his cosmogony, as angels, devils, magic, astrology, palmistry, mesmerism, and so on, is the certificate we have of departure from routine, and that, here, is a new witness. That also is the best success in conversation, the magic of liberty, which puts the world like a ball in our hands. How cheap even the liberty then seems, how mean to study, when an emotion communicates to the intellect the power to sap and upheave nature. How great the perspective! Nations, times, systems enter and disappear like threads in a tapestry of large figure and many colors. Dream delivers us to dream, and while our drunkenness lasts, we will sell our bed, our philosophy, and our religion in our opulence.